Richard Nixon came to office in early 1969 at a time of immense unhappiness in the United States. He was elected at the end of 1968. The Cold War was at its height. The Vietnam War was raging. The economy was in trouble. The previous year had been marked by the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson deciding not to run again, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, unrest, violence in the cities that summer. And Nixon then was elected with only 43% of the vote, and his party controlled neither house of Congress. That had not happened since 1848. Zachary Taylor was the last new president not to have either house on his side. And Nixon himself felt, of course, not only the Congress, but the press and the Washington establishment, the bureaucracy was not favorably disposed to him. So it was a difficult moment to become president. And yet in the midst of all that, and with so many other things going on, he launched in August, just 6 months into office, this really remarkable, creative approach to one of the central domestic problems, the whole mess that had arisen because of the nation's policies or lack of policy with respect to welfare. The plan Nixon unveiled in August of 1969 was a very controversial one. It was historians since have said that it was one of the boldest, most creative single domestic policy initiatives to come out of the White House since the New Deal. But what it called for was a floor under income, cash payments in lieu of welfare services, a guaranteed annual income, if you will, and an effort to, in the course of providing that, get rid of some of the incentives that existed in the old system, incentives for people not to work, or incentives for fathers to leave their families so that the family could qualify for welfare. Nixon expected conservatives to oppose this, partly because it added 13 million more people to the welfare rolls, at least initially. It was his hope, of course, that they would find their way into work and come off welfare and develop a new culture of self-reliance. But there was a lot of conservative opposition to it, which didn't surprise Nixon. What surprised him, he later wrote, was that the liberals, he says, pummeled it to death because they found the work requirements too punitive and the sums of money involved too meager. So, as somebody said, he went up the middle of the road in a sense and got hit from both sides. And one result was that the plan never did get passed. It got passed in the House of Representatives. It failed to get out of the Senate Finance Committee. But out of that plan and other creative elements that went with it have come a legacy of improvements in the way the nation approaches the problem of poverty. I think Richard Nixon's commitment to addressing the problems of poverty was a deeply felt one. He felt that he had grown up in a not well-to-do home. He grew up among many people who were poorer than his family was. He had felt, and he inherited this, I think, from his parents, that self-reliance was the great virtue, that the welfare system, as it had evolved over the years, created a culture of dependency rather than of self-reliance. And he would speak passionately and very articulately to these concerns. The way in which he constructed an answer drew on several resources. The whole concept of negative income tax, for example, had been heralded in rather conservative circles. Milton Friedman, the conservative economist, had been advocating a negative income tax where people actually, as their income fell below a certain level, got paid by the government rather than paying taxes to the government. But then, of course, the person who is often seen as the architect of the family assistance program was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, one of the first advisors Nixon named after he was elected, and someone who helped persuade Nixon that he, like Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister in the 19th century, could be a Tory man with Whig principles, which is to say he could be on the cutting edge of real reform because of his legitimacy as a centrist or conservative figure, and yet his willingness to be imaginative and creative with respect to social policy. The pleasure for a number of years now of doing a course which centers on Richard Nixon. I started this course at Northwestern University, and of course came with me when I came to George Washington University. It's it's about Nixon and his times. It's about Nixon as a case study of presidential communication. And of course, when one thinks back on the career of Richard Nixon, he was in the public eye, a rather central and controversial figure from the late 1940s. He was elected to Congress in 1946, exploded out of the national scene with the Hiss case in 1948, right up until his death in 1994. So that's a very long time to be on center stage. And during that time, the means of communication changed so dramatically. His first appearance was really as a radio figure and a newsreel figure in the days of the Hiss case. His famous Checkers speech, as it's popularly called, in 1952 was the first nationally televised political address of any sort, seen coast to coast live, and it of course saved his career. The debate with John Kennedy in 1960 was the first of the presidential debates. His own approach to communication in his campaign and in the White House was innovative, making use of much more sophisticated tools in terms of setting up his communication office, his press office, his speechwriting office, and so on. So it's an interesting way to trace the way in which leaders communicate with publics. And Nixon, who was vitally concerned about the communication process and rather brilliant at doing it, it makes it for a fascinating case study, which I've enjoyed teaching about for perhaps the last 12 years. George Washington School of Media and Public Affairs always says first about itself that it's located 4 blocks from the White House. And it really makes, it's wonderful for a school teaching about media and public affairs to be right at the heart of the action. There are about 400 students. There's a master's degree program. Students can major in journalism or in political communication. Wonderful faculty, very good students. They have to compete to get into the school. So those who are accepted to George Washington University then vie for positions in the School of Media and Public Affairs. And the kinds of students who come to Washington for their college education often are media and politics junkies. So it's a real pleasure to interact with these students and have a chance to share in their discovery of Washington and their pursuit of these topics.